He stood still, surrounded by silence. The blade gleamed under the dim torchlight. His expression, though twisted by madness, held a strange calmness. Caligula, once a living god, now a forsaken soul in his palace corridors. No cries, no mercy, only the sound of his own blood. He is beginning to seep into the cold stone floor. His life was a parade of horrors, orgies, incestuous acts, the absolute abuse of power. He ruled not with fear of the gods, but with a deep-seated terror of his own collapse. And yet, as his life came to an end, there was no tragic heroism, no grand fall, just a violent, pitiless slaughter, far from the throne, far from the praise he so desperately sought. But how does a god self-proclaimed fall, and who would dare push him to the edge of oblivion? It wasn't a guillotine that awaited him. It wasn't poison. His death was neither clean or swift. Caligula, the living god, would meet his end, not at the hand of a single assassin, but in the chaos of his own making. The air was thick with tension. Yet, the marble halls of his palace seemed colder with every step, as conspirators, those who once feared his wrath, approached him. He would die at their hands, drenched in his own blood. And yet not a scream left his lips. The scene unfolded like a macabre play. Kept his body the same one that had once danced in decadent celebrations, now a lifeless puppet. Who would remember the grandeur? Who would dare recall the madness? The message of power, Caligula's power. He was still in control, or so he thought. But the emperor could no longer distinguish loyalty from fear. His world had become a maze of lies and threats, and the more he isolated himself, the more fragile his reign became. His enemies were watching, waiting for the moment when the emperor's madness would finally swallow him whole. It was no longer a question of if he would fall, but when. His death had already been written in the stars, and it was only a matter of time before the final act was carried out. When Caligula was finally proclaimed emperor, it seemed like a miracle. His popularity among the people surged as they saw in him a figurehead, a symbol of vengeance against the old regime. For a time, his reign seemed promising. He was adored by the masses, and the Senate, once divided, gave him their allegiance, hoping that this young, charismatic emperor would restore Rome to its former glory. But behind the facade of charm, a far darker force was at work. Caligula, now in power, had learned how to manipulate Rome's political machinery with cunning precision. His speeches were intoxicating, his promises grand. But as the months passed, those who dared to oppose him were swiftly removed, exiled, executed, or worse, erased from the historical record altogether. For Caligula, there was no such thing as loyalty. Everyone was a potential rival, every smile a mask for betrayal. And when he stood before them, his image reflected in their eyes, he was not just Caligula the emperor. He was Caligula the divine. He began to believe in his own myth. He saw the Senate as nothing more than a group of lapdogs. He saw the people as tools for his own amusement, their lives disposable. And when he stood before them, his image reflected in their eyes, he was not just Caligula the emperor. He was Caligula the divine. But this belief would not come without consequences. What kind of empire would let its ruler go mad in such a fashion? What kind of world would allow the throne to become the final resting place of its monarch? He surrounded himself with sycophants and advisors, all of whom whispered praise in his ear, as feeding his ego, nurturing his delusion that he was a god among men. He took on titles, religious symbols, and extravagant acts that set him apart from any ruler before him. But it wasn't enough. He began to believe that he was invincible. He no longer feared death. Instead, he began to see it as a tool to solidify his rule. He declared himself divine, erecting statues of himself in temples and making sacrifices to his own likeness. His reign was marked by excess, orgies, cruelty, and an insatiable lust for control. Those around him, once proud to serve the emperor, now trembled at his feet. He surrounded himself with sycophants and spies, trusting no one, and ever watching for the slightest hint of betrayal. His rule was not just absolute, it was oppressive. He trusted no one, not even his family. His sister, Julia Livilla, whom he had once adored, became a target of his twisted desires. He did not see her as a sister, but as an object of his obsessive lust. His own blood became a casualty of his madness. As Caligula began to destroy the very family that had once helped him rise to power. Despite this, Caligula's power remained seemingly unshaken. Rome's wealth flowed into his hands, the imperial coffers growing ever richer, while the people, despite their suffering, whispered no word of revolt. So the streets of Rome were quiet, but under that silence, a storm was brewing. Those who had once feared his wrath began to see him not as a god, but as a broken man, a ruler on the brink of collapse. How long can a man rule through fear before the walls around him begin to crumble? How long can power last when it is built on deceit and paranoia? The first signs of rebellion were subtle, but they were there. Pues Caligula's closest confidants were now turning on him, even if only in whispers. They saw what he had become: a tyrant, a man who had forgotten the very virtues he once promised to uphold. And so the plotters began to take shape. One morning, Caligula awoke to a chilling message. 2 of his most trusted men had been executed without trial, their bodies left to rot in the public square. No explanation was given, no reason offered, just the silent message of power, Caligula's power. Well, he was still in control, or so he thought. He had built an empire of fear. But even the most fortified walls can crumble, and the fall of Caligula would be no exception. His death had already been written in the stars. When Caligula was finally proclaimed emperor, it seemed like a miracle. His popularity among the people surged as they saw in him a figurehead, a symbol of vengeance against the old regime. For a time, his reign seemed promising. His speeches were intoxicating, his promises grand. But as the months passed, those who dared to oppose him were swiftly removed, exiled, executed, or worse, erased from the historical record altogether. For Caligula, there was no such thing as loyalty. He surrounded himself with sycophants and advisors, all of whom whispered praise in his ear, feeding his ego, nurturing his delusion that he was a god among men. He took on titles, religious symbols, and extravagant acts that set him apart from any ruler before him. He began to believe that he was invincible. He no longer feared death. Instead, he began to see it as a tool to solidify his rule. He declared himself divine, erecting statues of himself in temples and making sacrifices to his own likeness. His reign was marked by excess orgies, cruelty, and an insatiable lust for control. Those around him, once proud to serve the emperor, now trembled at his feet. He surrounded himself with sycophants and spies, trusting no one, and ever watching for the slightest hint of betrayal. His rule was not just absolute, it was oppressive. He trusted no one, not even his family. His sister Julia Livilla, whom he had once adored, became a target of his twisted desires. He did not see her as a sister, but as an object of his obsessive lust. Well, his own blood became a casualty of his madness, as Caligula began to destroy the very family that had once helped him rise to power. Despite this, Caligula's power remained seemingly unshaken. Rome's wealth flowed into his hands, the imperial coffers growing ever richer. While the people, despite their suffering, whispered no word of revolt, the streets of Rome were quiet, but under that silence a storm was brewing. Those who had once feared his wrath began to see him not as a god, but as a broken man, a ruler on the brink of collapse. How long can a man rule through fear before the walls around him begin to crumble? How long can power last when it is built on deceit and paranoia? The first signs of rebellion were subtle, but they were there. Caligula's closest confidants were now turning on him, even if only in whispers. They saw what he had become: a tyrant, a man who had forgotten the very virtues he once promised to uphold. And so the plotters began to take shape. One morning, Caligula awoke to a chilling message. 2 of his most trusted men had been executed without trial, their bodies left to rot in the public square. No explanation was given, no reason offered, just the silent message of power, Caligula's power. He was still in control, or so he thought. He had built an empire of fear, but even the most fortified walls can crumble. And the fall of Caligula would be no exception. His death had already been written in the stars, and it was only a matter of time before the final act was carried out. The message arrived with an eerie stillness, not the usual rush of guards or soldiers. There was no entourage, no threat of immediate death, just a lone messenger delivering an order from the emperor himself. But this was not an order to kill. It was an order that would seal Caligula's fate, let him die on his own terms. The emperor, now isolated in his own palace, did not even flinch when the words were spoken. His life filled with excess and cruelty was about to end. Yet there was no grand display of anger or defiance. Caligula's world, once a glittering facade of godlike indulgence, had collapsed into the emptiness of his mind. No blood-soaked battlefield, no dramatic fight for survival. Instead, his death was to be a quiet personal tragedy. Oh, a king dethroned in a manner far more humiliating than a warrior struggle. Caligula stood before his mirror, one final time, the weight of his crown heavy on his head. He had wanted to be a god, but in the end, he was nothing more than a man. A dying man whose fate had been sealed by his own madness. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitter curses, no last words of defiance. Caligula's death was not the violent end that many had imagined for a man so full of power. Instead, it was quiet, stoic, almost serene. He nodded once to his wife, who had begged him not to go through with it. With a calm that betrayed the madness of his rule, he turned to her. "Help me bathe," he said, his voice low but steady. It will be the last time I ask for anything." His eyes held a deep sorrow, a resignation that no one had ever seen in him before. The man who once thrived on control, on power, now surrendered to the inevitability of his fate. The palace, once a place of debauchery and excess, became the stage for his final tragic performance. Caligula's hands, once powerful and capable of destruction, now trembled as he made the first incision. The blade was sharp, yet his movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. With every stroke, the blood flowed freely, running down his arm and dripping onto the cold stone floor. His wife cried out, desperate, her hands trembling as she tried to stop him. But Caligula, in his final moments, had no more desire for life. His empire was gone, his godlike status shattered, and now there was nothing left for him. His wife's pleas were ignored. She held his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin slip away as the blood continued to pour. And through it all, Caligula never made a sound. There were no screams of pain, no final plea for mercy, only the quiet, haunting silence of a man who had lost everything. It was as if his death were part of the grander tragedy of his life, slow, inevitable, and devoid of the heroism or grandeur that had once surrounded him. As the blood ceased to flow, the lamps flickered out. The light in the room dimmed, and in that final eerie quiet, Caligula's life faded away. There were no triumphant shouts, no valiant last stand. The man who had once been a god, whose name had reverberated through every corner of the empire, was now just a lifeless body, his power nothing more than a fleeting memory. And in that silence, Rome lost not just an emperor, but its last voice of reason. The power that had once been his was now gone. And with it, so was the empire's last hope for redemption. The palace, which had been a symbol of his madness and cruelty, now stood empty, a tomb for the emperor who had believed himself to be eternal. His death was not the end of the story. Yes, it was only the beginning of Rome's descent into darkness. The empire, once a symbol of greatness, was now a decaying carcass waiting for its final moments. The villa where Caligula had breathed his last fell into a profound silence. Outside, whispers spread like wildfire through the streets of Rome. The emperor, once worshipped as a living god, was gone. His death was not met with the public outcry or celebration that many had expected, but rather a hushed awe that seemed to linger in the air. Thick and heavy. The Senate, those who had long endured Caligula's whims, found themselves in a precarious position. Their ruler was dead, but his legacy of cruelty was still fresh. No one dared to speak his name aloud, yet the city buzzed with rumors. Had he died with dignity? Had he faced his end like a man or like a coward? His assassins, once unknown, became the unsung heroes in the eyes of many. Yet even in death, Caligula's shadow loomed large over Rome. His reign, marked by violence and paranoia, had left a scar that could not be easily erased. The imperial throne, now vacant, was a symbol of both freedom and fear. Freedom from the tyranny of Caligula, but fear of what might rise in his place. Caligula's death, though final, was not the resolution Rome needed. The empire did not find peace, nor did it find a ruler who could restore its former glory. Nero, the young emperor who would follow Caligula, had learned nothing from his predecessor's fall. Instead of bringing stability, Nero's rule became a terrifying continuation of Caligula's madness. Nero, who had once been Caligula's protege, now stood at the throne with all the arrogance and entitlement of his former mentor. The apple had not fallen far from the tree. He too believed himself a god. He too sought power at any cost, showing no concern for the people or the Senate. As the bloodshed continued, Nero's cruelty would rival that of Caligula, plunging the empire deeper into chaos. The Roman Empire, once the heart of civilization, now seemed to writhe in a perpetual state of corruption. The seeds of decadence and brutality that Caligula had planted were watered by Nero's reign. The city of Rome, once the crown jewel of the ancient world, now trembled beneath the weight of its ruler's cruelty. The aftermath of Caligula's death was a prelude to the deeper decay that would follow. Despite the end of Caligula's life, his legacy persisted. For centuries, historians and scholars would look back on his reign as the embodiment of tyranny and madness. His life, his death, and the empire he destroyed would be remembered not for its glory, but for the depths of depravity it reached under his rule. Yet even in death, Caligula's influence endured. His rise and fall became a cautionary tale for future rulers. His name became synonymous with cruelty and madness, an example of what happens when power is divorced from reason, when an emperor sees himself not as a servant of the people, but as a guide whose every whim must be obeyed. And his legacy lived on not only in history books, but in the twisted emperors who followed him. For Rome, Caligula's death was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a dark era, a time when the imperial throne would be stained with blood, and the people's suffering would be forgotten in the pursuit of absolute power. Caligula's story is not just one of a madman who wore the crown of Rome. It is the story of a kingdom that fell under the weight of its own excess. A lesson that even modern empires can be devoured by their own corruption. When Caligula died, the void left in Rome was palpable. For the empire, it was not just a change in leadership, it was the beginning of an inevitable spiral into deeper madness. The empire that had once been the most powerful in the world now stood on the edge of ruin. Caligula's death was not the end of Rome's suffering, but a catalyst that would accelerate its collapse. Nero's rise was merely the continuation of a tragedy. The people of Rome, though silent, knew the truth. They had suffered under Caligula's reign, and now they would continue to suffer under Nero. The darkness that had been birthed by Caligula's madness had taken root in the empire's very core. The seeds of cruelty, corruption, and tyranny had been planted. And even as the blood of Caligula stained the marble floors of his palace, the roots of his reign would continue to poison the Roman Empire for years to come. The empire was beyond saving. Sua's Caligula's death may have ended his reign, but the consequences of his madness would echo through the ages. His name would forever be linked to cruelty, power, and the destruction of an empire, a dark chapter in history that would never be erased. His legacy would be one of brutality, madness, and unchecked power. As the years passed, his name became synonymous with the worst excesses of imperial rule. Yet in the dark corners of the empire, whispers of his tyranny never truly faded. Baghdad Caligula had reigned as a god, but his reign had shattered Rome's very soul. His lust for power, his indulgences, his cruelty, all had led to his downfall. Yet despite his death, the empire could not escape the consequences of his actions. Rome, once a beacon of civilization, was now a shadow of its former self. Caligula's reign had cast a long, dark shadow over the empire, and that shadow continued to haunt the people long after his death. As Nero ascended the throne, many hoped for a new era of peace and prosperity. But instead, they found themselves trapped in the same cycle of madness that had defined Caligula's rule. The empire, once mighty, was now a playground for the insane. The empire was no longer a place of reason and stability. It had become a land ruled by fear, where the whims of mad emperors dictated the lives of its people. Caligula's death had not freed Rome from its torment, it had only passed the torch. And so the cycle continued. The people of Rome, once proud and free, were now subjects of a cruel and unpredictable ruler. Nero, like Caligula before him, cared not for the suffering of his people, but for his own desires. The empire that had once been a shining example of strength and unity now lay in ruins. Its glory faded, and its people were left to suffer under the weight of the madness that had been passed down through its emperors. Caligula's death, though a turning point in Rome's history, did not mark the end of its struggles. It was a brief moment of respite, but the darkness that had taken root in the empire's heart could not be so easily erased. The consequences of his reign would reverberate for generations to come. His cruelty had not only destroyed the lives of those closest to him, but had also torn apart the very fabric of Roman society, leaving it vulnerable to further decay. And so Rome, once a glorious empire, continued its descent into chaos. Caligula's death did not bring the peace that many had hoped for. Instead, it was a reminder that power, when abused, would only lead to destruction. Caligula's reign may have ended, but his influence on Rome persisted. His name became a symbol of the empire's downfall, a grim reminder of what happens when unchecked power is allowed to flourish. The empire had been poisoned by his madness. As the years went by, historians would look back on Caligula's rule as one of the darkest periods in Roman history. His reign would be studied not for its accomplishments, but for its sheer depravity and the catastrophic consequences it left behind. But Caligula's legacy was not just one of madness, it was a warning. His reign showed the world the dangers of a ruler who believed themselves above reproach, above the law, and above humanity itself. Rome would never fully recover. But the Senate, once the heart of Roman governance, had been rendered powerless by Caligula's cruelty. His reign left them broken, and even after his death, they struggled to regain their footing. The empire had been fractured from within. The citizens of Rome too had been affected. They had watched their emperor descend into madness, and now they were left to pick up the pieces. But the damage had already been done. Trust in their rulers had been shattered. Nero's rise to power was not the beginning of healing, but the continuation of Rome's suffering. He inherited not just the throne, but the madness that had defined Caligula's reign. Nero, like his predecessor, ruled with cruelty and a thirst for power. Caligula's influence would be felt long after his death. The empire, weakened by his rule, could not withstand the further abuses of power that came with Nero's reign. The foundations of Rome were crumbling, and no one could stop the inevitable fall. Yet, despite the passing of time, Caligula's name became synonymous with tyranny, cruelty, and the corruption of power. His reign was a tragic chapter in the history of Rome, but it was one that would forever be etched in the collective memory of the empire. The empire, once the shining beacon of civilization, had become a playground for a madness. Caligula's death did not mark the end of the chaos, it only paved the way for Nero, whose reign would further accelerate Rome's descent into darkness. As the years passed, the people of Rome grew weary. They had witnessed the fall of their greatest rulers, and the empire, once so mighty, was now a shell of what it had been. The memory of Caligula, like the empire itself, began to fade into ruin. Caligula's name became a curse, a warning to all who would dare to seek absolute power. His death did not cleanse the empire, it merely marked the beginning of a new cycle of tyranny, a cycle that would only grow darker under Nero's rule. As the empire continued its descent, the memory of Caligula lingered like a shadow over Rome. His reign had been one of decadence, madness, and cruelty, but it was also the moment when the true rot within the empire was exposed. The empire was crumbling its foundations, weakened by years of abuse, and the emperors who followed Caligula would only deepen the corruption. Rome, once the heart of the world, was now a decaying husk, struggling to survive in a world that had outgrown it. The people of Rome, once proud and mighty, had become slaves to their rulers. They had seen their leaders fall one by one, and the hope for a better future seemed lost. Rome's greatness was a distant memory, overshadowed by the madness of its rulers. Yet Nero, much like Caligula before him, believed himself to be above reproach. His cruelty and indifference to the suffering of his people were a direct continuation of the madnesses that had begun with Caligula's reign. The cycle of tyranny was far from over. Yet, even in the face of tyranny, there was still hope. Some Romans began to rise against the madness, seeking to restore the Republic and rid themselves of the emperors who had brought Rome to its knees. But the empire's decay was deep, and change would not come easily. Caligula's reign, while brief, had left an indelible mark on Rome. His cruelty had exposed the fragility of the empire and the dangers of unchecked power. But even in death, Caligula's madness continued to haunt Rome, leaving a legacy of fear and suffering. As the years passed, Rome would continue to struggle under the weight of its rulers. Caligula's story would be retold for generations, a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the madness that can consume even the most powerful of men. The empire, once the greatest in the world, would never fully recover from the scars of Caligula's reign. His death was not the end, but the beginning of a new era of suffering, one that would see the empire gradually fade into the pages of history. Caligula's death and the chaos that followed would forever define the history of Rome. His reign marked the point of no return for the empire, and though many rulers would rise and fall after him, none would ever erase the damage he had done.